Phil,
Pretty good.
welcome home.
Great to be home, but I couldn't help but be really pleased to see the dean wearing a business suit and Nike shoes, showing, But I think we can all be glad that basically I was not the founder of Jockey Underwear.
We'll try and make that a permanent change in Dean Levin's wardrobe. Now, Phil, we know you don't do too many public speaking events, and a question a lot of people have asked is, what does it take to get Phil Knight up on stage? So I thought maybe we should share the story of what got you here today. Now, you probably remember that we first crossed paths a couple of months ago, just over there at McDonald Hall. Mm-hmm. You were entering the building when I very politely interrupted you, introduced myself. We exchanged a couple of pleasantries, and then you went on inside about your day. Now, what you're probably less aware of, Phil, is that I decided to camp outside McDonald Hall for the next 40 minutes, watching every possible human exit to the building so that I could find you and, casually bump into you a second time to pitch you this interview. It's creepy, I know.
Yeah. That's how it happened.
I'll be honest, I was pretty nervous when you did come out that second time. It was fight or flight. I very nearly walked the other way. But there was this voice in my head. It just kept saying, Will, just do it. But really, Phil, we are so thrilled and excited to have you back on campus. And I think I speak for every student here when I say how grateful we are for this incredible business school.
Well, thank you. But, having stalked me for at least 40 minutes, I feel that there should be some payback.
Oh, don't do it.
I know that most of you know that Will's mother, Mags, has come all the way from Ireland to be here today. And having come such a long way, I think you should reveal something about yourself that she doesn't know.
Phil, I don't know what you're trying to suggest. I was a perfect child.
Well, did you make your bed this morning?
I didn't even sleep in my own bed this morning because I gave it to my mom. I gave it to my mom. That wasn't what it sounded like. All right, now, Phil. Phil, we don't want to make you feel old. This is payback, by the way.
Yeah, this could go back and forth a long time, that's right.
But it's been almost 60 years since you were here in our shoes, an incoming MBA, class of 1962. What kind of person was Phil Knight back at the GSB? How would you have described yourself?
Yeah, I will, but I want to tell you first about coming back to campus after being gone for a while. You go out 20 years or so, and you haven't been back for a while, and you come back, and it's more about just sharing a moment with family and friends. It's for a moment you step back in history and remember when you had all the world laying out before you, and you decided the things that you were going to find important, and it was really the start of you becoming what you ultimately became. When I come back, for just a moment, I always hear the voice of Frank Schallenberger, Bob Davis, Jim Porterfield. And I know that sounds sort of corny to an educated group, but I promise you that over half the people in this room, when they come back here 20 years from now, will have those same feelings. For me, it was, I was the guy that thought an extrovert was the person that stared at other people's shoes. It was a time for me to kind of grow and chase what I was really going to become. And so it was really a big transitional period for me in my life. And as I say, to this day when I come back, I still get inspired and lifted up.
Do you have any favorite memories from your days back at Stanford?
No, it was just a turning point in general for me. That you know, if I was honest, I'd say that my undergraduate career was really focused on track. And it got to be, when I got to be a graduate student, that I was really focused on what it was I wanted to be. And this was just the right school at the right time with the right inspirational professors. And it really doesn't get any better than that.
So you do graduate the GSB in 1962.
Yep.
This is a time when Silicon Valley isn't even a phrase yet.
Right.
And you had what you call this crazy idea. What was the crazy idea, and where did it come about?
Well, I took the entrepreneurship class from Frank Schellenberger, and basically the project, he had a term project where you basically either attach yourself to a company in the area or for the purpose of the paper made up a company and how it would succeed. And even in those days, a lot of my classmates were writing about electronics, which was certainly beyond me, since when I turn on a light bulb, when I turn on an electric switch, the light bulb comes on. It's magic for me. But my old track coach was always working with shoes, and that felt that you know, lightweight in shoes was something that was neglected by the major manufacturers, Adidas and Puma. And indeed, my senior year, Otis Davis won the Pacific Coast Conference Championship in a pair of homemade Bowerman shoes, which were an ounce lighter than the other shoes. So I kind of put those things together and said, if you were starting a shoe factory, would you start it in Germany? And I said, it's such a labor-intensive business, it makes more sense to start it in Japan. Japan being the country that took German cameras and dominated the camera market. Says, could they do the same thing in sport shoes? And that was really the thesis of the paper, which ultimately I got caught up in, and here we are.
Now, you got an A in that paper, right?
I did.
Okay. But
That mattered. If he'd have ridiculed the paper, I don't know where we'd be today.
But Phil, this was a time when entrepreneurship post-GSB was not just a less traveled path, it was probably a less celebrated path. What gave you the confidence to push ahead?
Well, if I didn't, I was going to have to be an accountant.
Yeah, no, that's a scary thought.
No, it was, no, but it was when I wrote the paper, it just stayed in my head. And at the time, I think the ratio was that 26 out of 27 new companies failed. So I knew the odds weren't high, but I really began to feel if I could do this, that would really be meaningful to me and something that I would really have a lot of passion for and about. And so that's where it started, and away we went.
Now, 2 years in, many of your classmates have gone down more traditional career paths. You're back in Oregon. You're living in your old room in the family house, and you're selling shoes out of the trunk of your car. Did you ever have doubts in those moments, and what was it that kept you going?
Well, obviously there were a lot of doubts, but I enjoyed what I was doing, and I really thought that I was bringing a product to the world that was better than the other product, and so I believed, and if you read the book, it wasn't too long before I had a bunch of other people that believed as well, and we just, through all the ups and downs, and there were plenty of downs, that we never stopped believing, and a lot of people say, why did you stay with it? There were a lot of negative moments and a lot of downturns, and I look back on those days, the most fun I ever had in business. It was every day, every Monday you went to work and you knew it mattered what you did, including whether you're going to meet payroll on Friday. But it was an exciting time, and Frank Schellenberger had done a wonderful job of preparing us for being an entrepreneur. Bob Davis, a marketing professor, said, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, he said, every day's a crisis and every Friday's a Jesus crisis. And it was kind of the way it was.
Now, you also talk in your book, Shoe Dog, about those early trips to Asia. So you're 24 years old, traveling alone to Japan. It's a culture you don't know, a language you don't speak, to try and broker that first shoe import deal. So this was a time before Stanford's global study trips or G-Mixes. Where did that ability to embrace hustle and uncertainty come from in you?
Well, by the time I got there, I believed. And so that I believed that that it was a good idea. I believe that if we could get a cooperative Japanese factory, that I could make the idea work. And so, yeah, I overcame, you know, when you're a bit of an introvert, why you basically have to believe. You have to overcome the shyness to take certain chances, and I was willing to do that. And you know, there were a lot of ups and downs, but ultimately it worked. And you know, I think at the end of the day, you got to believe, and that's what I did have, maybe above everything else. Mm-hmm.
Now, as you said, the team grew, and you weren't alone in this endeavor. And I think there's no story of Nike without, of course, mentioning Bill Bowerman, your former track coach at Oregon, later U.S. Olympics track coach, and of course, your co-founder of what became Nike. You've described yourself as a person who's always needed heroes. Why was Bill a hero to you, and what is it you learned from him?
Well, he was a very unique person. That he was probably the best track and field coach in the world, for one thing. But he was also had a certain command presence and a certain belief in certain leadership things that leaders did. You know, he said, "I'm not a track coach." He says, "I'm a professor of competitive response." And he had a way of having sayings that got your attention and really focused you on attitude. His strategy for running the mile was start out and run the first 2 laps at a very fast pace, run the 3rd lap as fast as you can, on the 4th lap triple your speed. And he said that you know, the Oregon Trail, he says, the cowards never started and the weak died along the way. That leaves you and me. And that's once again him getting at kind of your attitude. And his best one for me was always do right and fear no man. And so he had a big influence on my life, certainly the biggest influence other than my parents. And if you go back through his sayings and who he was always working on attitude. This is a man that had seen combat in World War II, you know, fired a gun and been fired at. And he had seen competition at its most extreme level. And he thought his job as a professor of competitive response was to get kids ready, young men and young women ultimately, to be ready for the toughest competition they can face. So, you know, he brought to me, you know, a certain attitude, which you can be an introvert and have attitude. And so that was sort of me. And he had a huge influence on that. And he was a hero of mine in those days and to this day.
When you first met him, you described it as love and fear at first sight.
Right. And then there was a little hate that came after that. But he really kind of believed in hazing, that you had to prove that you wanted to be there. And so he would make you go through hoops, which I did, somewhat reluctantly.
Now, beyond Bill, of course, you talk with a lot of affection about that core early Nike team. And I think you had a name for each other, right?
Well, yeah, we did.
Oh, I see. You're playing that game.
No, that's the first 4 or 5 people in the company, we wound up calling each other butt faces, which we don't do that anymore. We're a more professional group now.
You know, our view from the top team, we have a similar name for each other, actually. So.
Good. Yeah. That's healthy.
But what was it about that early team and that culture that made it so successful?
Well, I think, first of all, they were a bizarre group, to say the least, each of them in his own way. But they were, and I hope this showed in the book, that they were very able people that really kind of didn't get along with society in general. So it was kind of a perfect fit. And they complemented each other in terms of their abilities. And then lastly, all of them believed. It was, they just, when we would hit a down period, nobody thought, this is end. We're just, okay, we got to get together and find our way out of this one. And so it was fun being in a foxhole with those guys. And we basically, it's corny, but we loved each other, and we were going to go through this come hell or high water. And it was a very exciting, intense time. And as I say, I love those times.
You fought a lot of crises together.
Yeah, for sure.
In recent years, Phil, we've seen many high-profile, disruptive companies being pressured to rein in what we're seeing as aggressive, macho, win-at-all-cost cultures. cultures that have brought these companies so much early success in their life. Just last year, Nike faced some similar accusations, and the management team made some pretty decisive changes. When you grow from a startup to a 74,000 person team, how do you preserve the best of that winning culture in a more complex, diverse global workforce?
Yeah, well, you touched on a lot of things there that, I do think that Nike's culture is a big part of its reason for success. And the culture really was formed in the early days by the 4 people plus me, and it still exists to this day. A lot of people say, well, Phil had a dominant influence on that, and he didn't. I've often said many times, Nike is young and irreverent, and I'm neither. But it did, to use Barman's word, attitude. They came within a certain attitude, and it was sort of us. That's who we were. And the culture has been modified some, which is a good thing. But it's still kind of basically there, and I think it's a big part of its strength. So I hope that culture is basically in place, 20 years from now. And it's one thing, it fits with sort of our view then and now about what a brand is. It doesn't matter how many people hate your brand, as long as enough people love it. And as long as you have that, you can't be afraid of offending people. You can't try and go down the middle of the road. You have to take a stand on something, which is ultimately, I think, why the Kaepernick ad worked.
Well, let's jump into those athletes. So I want to take you back to 1978, Phil. You stumble across a shy, timid, retiring Stanford tennis player by the name of John McEnroe.
Timid, I wouldn't say.
Well, we got to see a little bit of John in that video, but for anyone who doesn't know tennis, John is a young, fantastic tennis player who's as well known for breaking rackets as he is breaking serve. He is everything that the tennis establishment at the time, the majority of the market, was not. So what made him the right ambassador for Nike?
Well, the story, basically, we had an agreement with Jimmy Connor's agent for him to wear Nike shoes. And he did. He wore them at Wimbledon. And the agent said, as soon as he gets back from Wimbledon, we'll get it signed. Well, he won Wimbledon. And as soon as he got back from Europe, boy, he had summer matches. And then came the U.S. Open. And he said, as soon as we get done with the U.S. Open, we'll get this contract signed. Well, he won the U.S. Open. And then we got down to sign the contract, and he says, I don't remember it this way. That was Jimmy Connor's agent, not Jimmy Connors himself. But that was the end of our endorsement with Jimmy Connors. And so the next year, I think it was, that when I went to Wimbledon, looking for the next great hope. And there were a bunch of really good young Americans, 18 and under. I was looking at the 18 and unders. And they had Brian Gottfried, who was a great player, and Elliot Telscher was a great player. And the head of USA Tennis was saying, those are really great endorsements. Stay away from that kid McEnroe. He's too much of a hothead. He's playing over on court 14. I went right to court 14. And basically that week he was playing the number 16 player in the world, Phil Dent. And he's 18 years old, and he hits his first serve in, and the chalk flies up, and the line judge goes out. McEnroe jumps over the net, puts his nose this far from an official, and he says, are you sure of that call? Are you very sure of that call?
Wow. And
I turned to the guy I was with and said, this kid's not afraid. And, I kind of became a fan of his intensity and his competitiveness and his attitude. He did lose control sometimes, but well, I always remember Frank DeFord's write-up of him in Sports Illustrated when he said, the big picture of McEnroe, says, why isn't this man smiling? He says, Beethoven didn't smile much either.
That's fair. A few years later, actually several years later, you decided to name the executive building at your headquarters in Oregon after John McEnroe. What is it you were trying to say to the team at Nike in doing that?
Well, we named all the buildings after our heroes at the time, and he was one of them, and that was where my office was.
Fair enough. You're glad to see him back playing well?
And that makes me feel even better.
Now, let's fast forward to 1984. You come across another decent basketball player. His name is It's Michael Jordan, that's it. Now, Nike were actually criticized at the time for overpaying for Jordan's signature. But of course, with hindsight, he became more than an athlete. He became a $2.5 billion revenue brand for Nike. Beyond MJ's greatness, what was it that made that brand so successful and so dominant?
Yeah, it isn't something you can bottle. It's been, truly one of the unique experiences really in all of marketing. That obviously he had it all, and we pretty much knew that coming in. I mean, he was Player of the Year. He was handsome. He could jump, and that he won the national championship with a winning shot. He had all of it, when we signed him for more than any rookie had been paid before. We signed him for $250,000 a year, and Fortune magazine ran a little insert. Another article says, there's no greater indication that Nike has lost its way than the fact that they paid Michael Jordan $250,000. And, but we can't combine it with what we thought was a really good shoe, a really distinctive shoe. It was red and black. It wasn't just white or black. And of course, he wore it to great performances. And then we had the added benefit of David Stern banned it in the NBA. So we immediately combined what became a good ad, says banned in the NBA, and every kid in the world wanted that. And it hasn't been straight uphill. It had a 1 year where sales actually went down, but overall that was what we got together was really good advertising, which reflected his personality, which was strong. And it's been an unbelievable success that when he quit playing, sales of Jordan brand product were $750 million. And this last fiscal year, they topped $3 billion. And long after he quit playing. So as I said to many people, imagine how much we'd sell if he'd never played.
We can only dream. Phil, it's Nike's 55th anniversary next week, I believe.
Yeah.
The company's at record revenue levels. And just last year, Nike was voted alongside Apple as the favorite brand of millennials. And I think there's a few of us in here who might attest to that. How does a brand stay so relevant to so many people for so long? Well,
it's hard work, but you have to work at it all the time. But I think, our thing, obviously, it starts with the product. The product is by far our most important marketing tool. And so we're constantly working to improve product. And so the recent upturn is because we've had a really good product pipeline. Probably the React running shoe is number one on the list, but there have been a lot of others, and so that's been really important. And then good advertising is critical to it. The Wieden and Kennedy experience has been is in many ways as dramatic as Nike's, and it's really been kind of alongside each other. When I first met Dan Wieden, I walked into the door of his quote office. He had 3 people besides himself sitting around a card table. And he said, "Welcome to Wieden Kennedy." And I said, "Well, Dan, I just want you to know one thing. I hate advertising." And he looked at me and he says, "Well, this will be interesting." And it has been. But it is interesting that, obviously if I would have said that to Procter & Gamble, I'd have been on, they take your $25 advertising budget and go on out the door. But they were a small advertising firm. And he grew to understand that what I didn't mean was that I hated advertising. What I meant was I hate traditional advertising. And he found ways to find out who Nike is or who Michael Jordan was and project that to the consumer. And not only did Nike, succeed, Wieden and Kennedy now has offices all over the world, over 1,000 employees. It has Coca-Cola as a client, it has Honda as a client, it has a lot of the world's most famous brands as clients. They've been an enormous success. And to this day, they work really hard at trying to find out, who it is and who the athlete is and how to project them. I know we had Boris Becker, the great tennis player, and we were trying to get him as an endorsement, and Dan Wieden was making the pitch, and he says, "We will find out who you are and project that to the world." And Boris says, how in the world can you know who I am when I don't know who I am? and Dan just says, well, we'll find out. Well, we didn't make the sale. We didn't sell him. But that is one of the things they've done. So the advertising and the product are two of the really important things. And then keeping the product fresh and keeping the advertising fresh. And it's an ongoing challenge, and we don't always hit it. You know, a couple of years ago we took a little dip, and it's a very, very competitive business. And every 6 months is kind of a new life, and everybody has to be aware of that.
Phil, this is a school and a speaker series dedicated to leadership, so we want to make sure we touch on that topic. Something the MBA 1 class is challenged with each year is, why would someone follow you? I think there can be a stereotype of what a CEO should be. Sometimes we think of them as a natural extrovert. Around the valley, sometimes they can be hero-like characters. You've described yourself as shy, introverted, someone who identifies with the born loser. How were those... That's why we get on, right? But how have those traits helped you as you built Nike?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, obviously, introverted people have a tendency to listen, which I think good leaders do. But when I was in school, you know, they talked about two different types of leadership. They talked about autocratic leadership and democratic leadership. And, you know, it was only 15 years after World War II, and, you know, they had two of the great autocratic leaders ever, Douglas MacArthur and George Patton. And they, at the time, were looked on as being very successful. That then you have a democratic style leadership, which is the other thing is getting people involved and talking to people. And so I think it's probably almost impossible for an introvert to be an autocratic leader. But an introvert can be a democratic leader. And as the idea of democratic leadership progressed, they started to use the term collaborative leadership, which is really, in my view, the ultimate and only kind of leadership to this day. That in this day and age, the autocratic leader doesn't work. It can work for temporarily, but it won't work long run. And I hope that the people in this auditorium today don't get the idea that hero leadership means being autocratic. You know, that, I mean, obviously I think Steve Jobs is looked at as really kind of, in this area, and the whole world really has been one of the great leaders, which I believe he was. But I do believe at the end of his career, he was beginning to modify his, you know, natural autocratic style, which, if you will, got him fired his first tour around Apple. And as he got to go through Apple the second time, there was a change in Steve Jobs. And you notice that from the commencement speech he gave to Stanford University, and he hired Tim Cook, and he had a lot of give and take with Tim Cook. And Tim Cook, who I know quite well, is very much a collaborative leader, and I believe a great collaborative leader. So I think that it just, don't equate hero leadership with autocratic leadership. The only style of leadership that will work in this day and age is collaborative leadership.
Hey Phil, another thing you may know about this group is that we're a pretty touchy-feely bunch these days. Of course, in your book, you've described business as war without bullets.
Yep.
So, as you look back on those early days at Nike, dealing with those crises, were soft skills tools an entrepreneur like you could really afford back then?
What type of skills are you talking about?
The softer skills, the touchy-feely skills.
Oh, I think, yeah. I mean, I think that if you read the book Shoe Dog, obviously I don't come across as a touchy-feely type, and neither were any of those top 5. But there's lots of different ways of communicating, and one of the things I don't like about the politically correct movement is that, to me, politically correct has been founded by people that couldn't communicate. And they don't want you to communicate very well either. Because communications really is a kind of an individual thing. Everybody's a little bit different. It's like people have different fingerprints, they have different personalities, they have different emotions. And I think the leader's job is to know who his team is. And there's different ways to communicate with that team. We weren't touchy-feely in the sense that we were always patting each other back and say how we feel. But you could say, "How you doing today, you son of a bitch?" and mean the same thing. So there's just different ways to do that.
I think we need to bring that into the chat around campus these days. Now, Phil, we also study a lot here how leaders act in times of crisis. Nike and yourself have dealt with several. Today, the Nike brand is stronger than ever, but of course, in the late 90s, Nike did for some time become synonymous with sweatshops and slave wages. As you look back, how do you feel you handled that crisis? What would you do differently, and what are you most proud of?
Well, one of the things that we didn't talk about in business school when I was here was the media. And so I think probably this group is probably much more aware of the media, but it's always there. It's more prevalent than it's ever been, and they're not always consumed by facts. And so when the first charges came that Nike runs sweatshops, that it's a really seductive argument to say this person only makes $4 a day, and Michael Jordan makes $30 million a year, and Phil Knight's worth $2 billion, and isn't this awful? But our initial reaction was that we don't run sweatshops, and that you're wrong. And I was the CEO at the time, and that was my strategy, and it was awful. It didn't work. And so we kind of, after about a year of that, it became clear. And so we took another tack, which says, yeah, you can criticize it once, but this is what we're going to be, and this is how we're going to be a better company over the next 10 years, and we're going to take these steps each year, and you come look at any of our factories anywhere in the world that you want. And we've kind of been on that path ever since, and that's basically working. And I do think, that we have had lots of good comments that don't get much publicity from the media. And one of the good ones was a member of the United Nations says Nike's the gold standard for all apparel companies and how they run their factories. And it's a constant battle, though, because we're always kind of looking for new factories or changing factories. And we have most of our shoe factories and our good apparel factories have been with us for 20 or 25 years, but economics change at different times, so you do change some of them on the periphery. So it's a constant battle to live up to the standards we have. But we have a whole team at Nike that does that all the time and basically is talking to people on the production line all the time. And I do think that our factories are the best in the world right now for conditions. And it's a basic truth that great shoes are made by great factories. You don't want a bad factory making the best shoes in the world.
Now, Phil, something else we hear a lot from the media, but also occasionally at Stanford, is to find and follow your passion. And you are perhaps the example of someone who built a business dedicated to something they love, which is sports and athletes. There's many of us in the room today who I feel are struggling to maybe tie our true passions to a viable business or career. What would you say to people like us?
Well, I think, that one thing that is left out is that you got to have a niche. You got to have a reason to succeed. My reason was that, Japan could make shoes economically. And then the rest of it, fit right in home base for me. So, and I do think if you're going to be an entrepreneur, it has to be something that you really love, because there will be a lot of dark days. And as I say, we never hesitated in those dark days. So I was fortunate enough to find what I thought was a niche to go with my passion. And that's what you need to bring those two things together. But when you do, you're very, very fortunate, and take advantage of it.
All right, well, look, Phil, this has been brilliant thus far. I know Nike say there is no finish line. We do need to finish in about 15 minutes. Phil, this has been brilliant. We're almost going to let you go, not quite yet. There's a little tradition we like to do up here on stage. We call it a lightning round. So the idea is I'm going to ask you a set of either-or questions. We want you to answer the one answer that comes first in your mind, okay?
You didn't warn me about this.
You didn't tell me you were going to mention me, Mom.
I might get back to her.
All right, look, because it's a new thing, we're going to start easy and then we'll get harder, okay? So, Jordan or LeBron?
No. You know, that's like asking which of your kids do you like better.
Okay, you can tell me backstage, it's fine. Rose Bowl or Super Bowl?
Rose Bowl.
340-mile or 2-hour marathon?
2-hour marathon.
Nice. Suit or tracksuit?
Oh, man. Tracksuit.
Just Do It or Dream Crazy?
Just do it.
Hawaii or Palm Springs?
Hawaii.
Beatles or Rolling Stones?
Beatles.
That was easy. Breaking Bad or The Sopranos?
Ooh. Probably Sopranos, but that's tough.
We were told it was tough for you. Adidas or barefoot?
Yeah. Barefoot.
Ladies and gentlemen, Phil Knight.
Thanks. It was fun.